Three Lives, Three Lives and Company is on a corner in the West Village across the street from an overpriced ice cream parlor. Along the hand-carved wooden shelves, glowing under Jolly Rancher green lamps, there's fiction and non, frontlist and backlist, picture books and cookbooks, art and architecture, Granta and graphic novels, the Paris Review, and all things New York. The dog treats are behind the counter. Toby, the owner, wears a soft gray beard and beanie and drinks a Balzacian amount of coffee. He owns the bookshop outright, yet doesn't think of it as his shop. He says he's merely the custodian. It's the bookshop, not Toby, that has a relationship to the customers. And likewise, Dr. Gary, the rheumatologist who once diagnosed a bookseller with shingles over by the biographies, Henry, the Broadway composer who makes melodies from random lines and random books, and the parade of volunteers who help wrap in December and share popcorn tins hidden underneath the counter, are all referred to by the same title, Friends of the Shop. Sometimes loved ones will phone with news that a longtime customer has died. The bookstore ought to know. When customers send Christmas cards, letters, and snacks, they address them not to a person, but to the shop. Calling them customers doesn't even sound right, probably because many of them hardly ever buy anything. Bookstores are community spaces and capitalist enterprises, sometimes more obviously one than the other, sometimes seemingly stuck in the space between. Business is cold and calculating, books are warm and invaluable. The very notion of a book business can seem oxymoronic. In 1821, Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison that books are more like capital, not products for mere consumption. Three Lives is hardly just another retail store. The quintessential shop around the corner is part of what makes the village feel like a village. It has charm, soul, personality. And more than anything, Toby doesn't want to screw it up. And I start the book at Three Lives because this is really the bookstore that opened up what indie bookselling can mean to me. And there's a personal story here. I was in graduate school studying American history, and my wife got a job at this bookstore. And it was really through her experience and me hanging out here that, as a historian, began to ask the kind of questions that are at the heart of the book. So that's why I start the book there. And I introduce my own kind of introduction to this world and experience with contemporary bookstores, and very much set the stakes of the book as kind of trying to understand what we've lost in America by losing bookstores and what remains the sort of compelling case of why these institutions are so vital. And then I sort of proceed basically chronologically and start each chapter as a profile of a different kind of bookstore that's important in a particular moment in American history. And so I start with Ben Franklin. And these images, I should say, aren't in the book because I think they're garbage, but they're sort of recreated images many years after the fact. And you can find them in various places online. Some show up even in the 19th century, but I don't think any are particularly accurate. But so goes when we're writing about, the mid 18th century. Yeah, and I should say he's basically in the business of book selling and printing in the 1730s and 40s. And then I profile what's known as the Old Corner Bookstore, which starts in 1828. And I'll read a small bit from the opening of this chapter. The writers who frequented the Boston bookstore slash print shop slash publishing enterprise weren't just the usual sort. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Harriet Beecher Stowe came to talk religion, music, theater, and philosophy. Nathaniel Hawthorne preferred not to talk much at all. Customers described the scene as a lounge, a resort, a literary exchange, the place to learn which new books are forthcoming. Longfellow, who regularly made the trip over from Cambridge, relished the fact that the loiterers were also the makers of books. Yet anyone could walk in off the street, browse, and strike up a conversation. The store was a de facto public space, meeting space, communal space that was neither a house or church or political hall. And it was the center of a transformation, the birth of the modern American bookstore. And I, in the chapter, write about why this bookstore is so important and is different from a lot of the other ones at the time, which is basically this sense of community, that it's a hangout space, and that it's extremely browsable by the standards of the time, both in terms of how the books are displayed, but also the kind of atmosphere that encourages people to just come and pick up books and sample them and look at them and browse them in ways that we, of course, associate with bookstores today. This is just an image of William Ticknor, and this became a very famous publishing house, many of you probably know. And in his office was Nathaniel Hawthorne, his dearest friend. And part of the reason the bookstore was so special was because of so many of the great American writers who really called it home, not just as a publisher, but just spent a lot of time there. And as Matthew knows from Google Street View, it's currently a Chipotle. So there is a plaque on the outside of the wall that pays tribute to its literary history, but it's actually impressively preserved. And there's a whole long history about a various preservation group that took up this challenge. And so on the exterior, it's remarkably well intact of what the building looked like on the corner of Washington and School. So I try and profile very different kinds of bookstores. And what's so interesting to me in American history is how different models at different times seem to be the fashionable or at the vanguard. So this is an image from the 1920s of Marshall Field and Company. And in the United States, department stores, at least most of the leading department stores at the turn of the century and throughout at least the first 30 or 40 years, had dedicated book sections. And what I found interesting, as somebody who grew up in a kind of chain bookstore environment, was how the kind of popular discourse, saw these entities as kind of corporate sellouts. But from as far as I can tell, Marshall Fields was not only the largest American bookseller at the time, but was really the most admired also in many ways, and was famous for a very kind of personal touch, and felt like to many people a kind of great standalone bookstore, and that its size didn't diminish its reputation. And of course, these bookstores, book sections fall out of favor for a variety of reasons. I have chapters on mobile book selling. So a Parnassus on Wheels, which of course was a famous book from Christopher Morley that inspired this boom of mobile book selling, which I thought was fun and interesting. And I have a chapter on sidewalk booksellers, and is just interested in outdoor book selling and thinking about what the context of that space was like. Was a lot of fun. And I can see in Evan's picture of his family's bookstore, these, books that are outside that you can browse on the porch, which I think is a fascinating thing to think about. And relatedly, outdoor book browsing was a huge deal at the Gotham Book Mart, which is another chapter I profile. And you can see some of the outdoor stalls in half of the image here from a very early period. And then from a very much later period is Frances Steloff, who founded this bookshop in 1920 and stayed there until she was 100 years old. And I'm sure many of you, and Matthew and others of you, have written a lot about modernist literature, and surely know something about the Gotham Book Mart and its kind of place in the vanguard of American literature. although I wanted this book to be a popular book and had the sense that it might appeal to people who love bookstores and casual readers, I also didn't want it to be what many reviewers call it, as essentially a love letter to bookstores, even if I do love bookstores and appreciate their power. And so I thought it was important. Oh, this, by the way, is Francis Steloff's desk, which should make us all feel better. So, look around your room and enjoy some relief that this is not your desk. So this is a chapter on a Nazi bookstore, which was in Los Angeles, and was kind of hard for me to believe that this was in no way an underground operation. This was on a main street, with posters and signs and swastikas aplenty. And there were at least a handful of these in the 1930s and remained in business until the United States entered World War II. And so what was interesting in many ways is how the Nazi bookstores were similar to other kind of activist bookstores, as thought about places to disseminate information and to politicize and propagandize. So I have a chapter on used bookstores, and I probably should have written more. And there's obviously a whole different world about antiquarian bookstores and just kind of used bookstores selling cheaper works. So I highlight this neighborhood in New York that was known as Book Row, that was home to dozens of used bookstores in this very concentrated area that became so definitional that a whole neighborhood was sort of known as this. And the lone survivor is the Strand, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, this great New York emporium of used books. Now it sells new books, but was famous as this used bookstore. And I highlight some of the characters behind that who are seen here. Other activist bookstores. This is from Oscar Wilde, which is one of the first gay bookstores in the United States, started by the guy you can see here named Craig Rodwell. And I just thought it was fascinating that Rodwell really wasn't even a heavy reader, knew nothing about books or the book business, but thought that the bookstore would be a kind of necessary anchor for a civil rights campaign. And he turned out to be right and built a very successful store that lasted 50 years. Profile other activist bookstores. This is a place called Drum and Spear in Washington, D.C. that was short-lived in the late 1960s and early 70s, and was trying to promote, Black consciousness, civil rights, and really to attract a kind of book browsers that often didn't feel welcome elsewhere. And I go all the way up into the present day and interview Ann Patchett and Parnassus as this kind of face of modern indie bookselling. And I'm interested in indie as a kind of brand and what that means. And at least in the United States, there are a lot of celebrities and writers and philanthropists who have opened bookstores almost as a matter of charity, or like one might have opened a symphony hall, in the 1890s. And then I'll just read a little bit about You've Got Mail, which is a famous movie here in the States. And obviously, we all know bookselling is such a romanticized profession. And one of the other themes I was interested in is the way in which the kind of discourse around bookselling bleeds into reality. So I have this chapter on Parnassus on Wheels, the book, which inspires all sorts of people, of course, to open up bookstores. And so much of what people know or think they know about bookselling comes from popular culture. So I'll just conclude by reading a small bit about this film. When I told people what I'm working on, the most common response, other than the terribly annoying question, when will you be finished, was in one way or another about You've Got Mail. Have you seen it? Yes. Are you going to write about it? Yes. Maybe you can interview Tom Hanks. Maybe. Aside from Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, Hugh Grant, Notting Hill, and Audrey Hepburn, Funny Face, both play memorable and unusually good-looking booksellers. Both find love rather than rare first editions. To be sure, these films are sappy and tropey, and many of the books about bookstores can easily be dismissed as navel gazing, sort of like Hollywood's propensity to make movies about Hollywood. But there's a reason screenwriters and book writers love setting their stories in bookstores. They can be romantic spaces, places of discovery and chance and wonder. They can be community spaces, activist spaces, political spaces, intellectual spaces. And they can be refuges, places to get lost, to find oneself. Whether in mysteries or memoirs, travel or true crime, romances or rom-com, horror or history, bookstores can be more than just the passive backdrops. Bookstores can be the actors. Bookstores, even the little ones, can shape the world around them. They already have. So I will stop sharing here if I can figure out how to do so.
Real quick, I think there's something up with the Zoom link and the meeting might
Thank you,
end
Matthew.
in a minute. So if everyone could click on the link in the chat to switch over. I mean, we're not sure. I just don't want the meeting for you all to get lost. Yeah, because there's been this ticking clock for the last 10 minutes. So if you could switch over so we don't, and then we'll continue the conversation in the link in the chat.
Sorry about this.